Let's get started. Welcome to our United Church of Christ Just Peace webinar titled Don't Shoot, MLK and Gun Violence Then and Now. We are so excited that we have such a great lineup this evening of folks who will be speaking to this issue. But first, I want to recognize the wonderful team of folks who have been working on just peace issues in the life of the United Church of Christ. We have persons here from our steering committee. And so we're excited for all of you who are with us. And we have our co-chairs of our committees as well. One committee is from our membership and engagement, and they've worked to help promote this and make sure that our UCC Just Peace churches come out tonight. And the host committee for this event is our education and advocacy. And our co-chairs are with us tonight, and that's Bob Moore, and Steve is also with us. All right, Steve Patterson, thank you for waving. I just also would like to share a brief statement that's taken from our Just Peace church book that was edited by Susan Thistlethwaite. And in it, it talks about what it means to be just peace. And it's a wonderful way to remind us why we do this good work. It says, for just as the body is one and has many members, and all the members are of one body, though many are one body, so it is with Christ. And we're reminded of this as we do this work. It follows up later on in the introductions to say, often the peace to which most people refer when they use the word peace is symptomatic of the absence of real peace, a just peace, which Jesus referred to when he approached the great city of Jerusalem. There on the hillside, as he looked down on the city, seeing its injustices, the hunger, corruption, violence, and the vying for power, he wept and said, if only today you knew the things that make for peace. Peace is not merely the absence of war, but the presence of just social relations. We come at this work from that lens because we are reminded that peace, true peace, does involve our involvement and our involvement for social relations and a just social relations. So thank you for being here tonight as we embark upon one of those issues. And so we will continue now with Sandy Sorensen, who is an amazing, amazing advocate. She heads up our United Church of Christ, Washington, D.C. office, and she will continue sharing at this time.
Thank you, Sheila, so much. That was very generous. I don't know how many days I feel very amazing these days, but at any rate, but together we're stronger. So it's good to see all of you. Really, really good to see all of you. And I'm delighted to be here tonight. So I wanted to just open by acknowledging that this week is the 4th annual National Gun Survivors Awareness Week. So it's very fitting that we are meeting this week. And we're also facing an escalating crisis of gun violence in the United States. Over the last 2 years, we've seen fairly dramatic increases. There's so many statistics that we can point to. I think one of the ones that really kind of got my heart was that firearms are the leading cause of death for children in America. And if that's not a moral crisis, I don't know what is. And so it's important for us as people of faith to be here today. this is indeed a moral crisis, and this is our time to act. The legislative train on the federal level around gun violence has been stalled, and we are facing a lot of reluctance on the Senate side to get some of our really great gun violence legislation passed. And so we're trying to work through other avenues, and I'll talk more about what some of those other avenues are. But what the uphill battle around moving federal legislation has caused encouraged the gun violence prevention community to really look at other ways that we can make a difference. And one of those ways is by supporting and engaging in community-based intervention programs and trauma-informed care programs. And that is what led me to think about our keynote speaker for tonight, Reverend Dr. Larita Barnes Rice. And I attended a gun violence prevention conference that was headed by the Center for American Progress last December. And Reverend Dr. Rice was on a panel of people who were talking about the importance of community violence intervention and how we can support that as a congregation. And so, I'm hoping that we can explore more about that area and use this time to really ask ourselves as people of faith, what is our role in a society that's increasingly numb to death and violence, where the ownership, the right to own a gun, unrestricted right to own a gun trumps any kind of legislative, sensible, meaningful, responsible legislative means to prevent gun violence. And I think that Geoffrey will help us to rest in the faith tradition that can guide us forward in a really difficult time.
Thank you, Sandy. That was a really good way to frame our talk tonight. And the next person to speak with us is someone who is truly grounded in what it means to be a just person. He is our immediate past president, the general minister and past president for the United Church of Christ. And he has brought with him such a wonderful love for justice and peace. He has been an instrumental person on our steering committee. And so looking forward to hear his words tonight as we speak about MLK and the role of gun violence then and now. Geoffrey?
Well, thank you, Sheila. It's good to be with all of you tonight and to share a few thoughts about how the legacy of Martin Luther King Jr. really is very much present with us and related to this issue of gun violence. And as I reflected on it, this theme kept running through my mind of from fear to fearlessness. And I'll talk a little bit about that this evening. Martin Luther King was well aware of the oppressive violence visited on African Americans in the South and elsewhere in America. And no doubt he knew of the long tradition of self-defense that African American people embrace to encounter that, to counter that violence. And so it should come as no surprise that in the initial stages of the civil rights movement, back around the bus boycott, his impulse was to arm himself, protect his family, and as the death threats mounted. Understandably, in that moment, he was afraid for his family and he was afraid for himself. Now, some find this really inconsistent with his image as a staunch advocate of peaceful, nonviolent, direct action. However, it is important to understand that nonviolence was not Martin Luther King Jr.'s starting point. It was not his starting point. he grew into it, as all of us can grow. In a sense, he was on a journey, an evolutionary journey that moved him away from the use of violence and violent means, even in self-defense, to a deep commitment to nonviolence, not only as a strategy and a tactic for change, but as a way of life. I think that Dr. King's personal journey was a journey from fear to fearlessness. I'm going to say a little bit more about that. Along the way, though, he had more than a little to say about gun violence in America. After the assassination of John F. Kennedy in 1963, Andrew Young recalls Martin Luther King saying, "Guns are going to be the death of this country." Think about that. Guns are going to be the death of this country, said Martin Luther King. At another point along the way, he said, "By our readiness to allow arms to be purchased at will and fired at whim, by allowing our movie and television screens to teach our children that the hero is the one who masters the art of shooting and the technique of killing, by allowing these developments, we have created an atmosphere in which violence and hatred have become popular pastimes." It is ironic that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated in an act of gun violence. That fact was not lost on those who created and pushed for the first federal gun legislation, gun safety legislation, the Gun Control Act of 1968. But since then, over 50 years ago, guns in the hands of Americans have proliferated. It is not an exaggeration to say that the way of the gun is the American way. One way to describe our culture is as a gun culture. Guns are a form of recreation, and we are entertained by gun-related violence on TV and movies and video games. We have waged war in Asia and in Africa with our guns. After all, what is a drone but an AK-47 or a Glock on steroids? We are the world's greatest exporter of armaments, and I believe this is related to the level of domestic gun violence we experience. The trade is legal and illegal. Is there a difference? The outcome is almost always the same: injury and death. If we listen carefully, though, go back and listen carefully to Dr. King's last sermon. We all know it, the mountaintop sermon. We hear him saying in the deepest and most passionate tones, "I am not afraid of any man." Now, he could have said anyone, but that was 1968. He said, "I am not afraid of any man." And I would say that that was Martin Luther King making his declaration of fearlessness. At that moment, the death threats that he had endured for years were still there, only with greater intensity. I believe Dr. King knew intuitively that those threats were real and that an attempt to end his life was imminent. However, as he made it clear in that moment, those threats did not matter. What mattered was the transformation of America from its racist past to a new and inclusive future. What mattered was the mission of justice and peace in America and the world. This issue of gun violence in America is larger in scale and broader in scope and more deeply ingrained in the soul of America than we have dared to imagine. Reducing gun-related violence in America will require a cultural transformation, a conversion of sorts. The cultural transformation I speak of does not happen overnight, but it can and will happen. However, this change will require fearless mass movement, a fearless mass movement of like-minded people, people who bear a spiritual likeness and a kindredness to the Reverend Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. The good news, and there is good news, is that that movement is already afoot, and we're going to hear more about it tonight. This evening's webinar will focus on that movement, bringing to our attention the many fearless organizations and individuals still struggling in these most difficult days.
I'm sitting in the pulpit, I had nothing. All I could think about is you are going to die.
Every facet of American
I
life,
had nothing.
poisoning our present and threatening our future. Thanks for these minutes with me.
Wow, very powerful words. Thank you so much, Reverend Geoffrey Black, for those words on MLK and gun violence then and now. A lot of good reflections there. And hopefully we'll be able to build on those in our discussion later on, maybe through the Q&A. At this time, I'm going to ask that Sandy come back and introduce our guest speaker for the evening.
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you, Dr. Black. That was powerful, and it really grounds the conversation that we're about to have, because it is a larger conversation than just this piece of legislation or that piece of legislation or this action or that action. There's really no singular thing that we can do, but there are many, many things that we can do to turn the tide on the crisis of gun violence. I like to use our General Synod in 2017 passed a resolution looking at gun violence, the gun violence epidemic as a public health issue. And I was reading a little bit about a doctor who said, what does that look like? What does it look like? How does it look like a public health approach in terms of our approach to the COVID-19 pandemic, for example? And he talked about the fact that, what did we do? We studied the virus. We learned about the virus. We mapped out when it was happening and where and who it was affecting. We studied vaccination possibilities. We studied ways to mitigate the spread of the virus. We looked at both personal and collective ways that we could slow or stop the spread of the COVID-19 pandemic. And that's exactly what really needs to be done in terms of our response to gun violence. And so I'm really excited to have with us Dr. Larita Rice Barnes, who, as I mentioned, I heard at a panel on gun violence prevention earlier in December, and was very struck by the importance of, or thought about the need for our faith communities to think about growing some new and emerging partnerships, forging some alliances that maybe we hadn't thought about before, working across the places where diverse communities intersect. And so I'm so delighted that Dr. Rice Barnes is here to speak with us tonight. She is, she's an amazing woman. She is an author, an entrepreneur, a life coach, a pastor, a change agent, a global political advisor, a transformational leader. She's a wife, a mother, and a friend. And Dr. Larita Rice Barnes currently serves as the executive director of Metro East Organizing Coalition in St. Louis. And I should add, she's a native of East St. Louis, so she knows this area very well. And the Metro East Organizing Coalition works to prevent gun violence. They also work to address mass incarceration and really to address racial and social and economic disparities in our communities. And so Dr. Rice Barnes, welcome and thank you for being here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Good evening to everyone. I want to first say thank you to Alex and to Sandy and the event hosts and organizers for inviting me to be a part of such an amazing event. Reverend Dr. Larita Rice Barnes, as Sandy said, I am the Executive Director of Metro East Organizing Coalition. I am the Social Justice Chair at Eden Theological Seminary. And also the pastor of Empowerment of Grace. I want to take a moment to just share a snippet of what drives me to this work. As Sandy mentioned, I'm born and raised in East St. Louis, Illinois, where an article was updated that says that you are 27 more times likely to be shot and killed in East St. Louis than in any other US city. The population is roughly under 27,000. Growing up, I had two friends, two close friends who were killed by gun violence. I remember seeing one of them named David, who was around 14 at the time, lay on the ground as he was dying and a teardrop rolling from his eye. My other junior high school friend, who we affectionately called Mimi, was shot in the head around age 13. For years, I would have visions of her laying inside of the casket. It was stated that her gunshot was from playing Russian roulette, while other conversations said that it was staged. Both were very traumatic experiences for me. So I got so many other to name around gun violence, the drive-by shooting that happened while we were outside, and even having a gun put to my head by a gentleman that was seriously involved in gang affiliation because I didn't want to engage in a relationship with him. Very horrific experience. That became part of my experience, and I began to share this with my church and executed a strong ministry of presence and a public ministry of presence. I began to incorporate this kind of thinking in my preaching, sharing it in Bible studies. We had Sabbath Sundays where we talk about this epidemic of and/or public health crisis of gun violence. I created a chaplaincy ministry at our church, and then ultimately introduced an urban chaplaincy program at Eden Theological Seminary, where I am currently a student and social justice chair, to provide training and insight to those who had an interest to show up more in their community. I began to take hold of this idea of perfect love cast out fear. Our church became active with organizing clergy by hosting monthly meetings on the importance of clergy being involved in their communities and the affairs of their communities. I deeply believe in the ministry of presence. You'll hear me bring that up a lot because of gleaning that understanding of clergy showing up. Our church has always been connected to the poor and underserved in disenfranchised communities. We developed Grace Closet. That's a ministry where families can come and shop for free clothing, for interviews, for funerals, just for everyday wear if they need it. We also developed Grace Cafe. Grace Cafe is a kitchen, a community kitchen where people can just pop in and eat, get a meal, sit down and fellowship. We developed a mobile hotspot in one of the area hotspots, taking surveys, passing out PPE, food and other essential items. When I think of CVI and/or community violence intervention, I think of the organizations, the community stakeholders, trusted sources, or credible messengers, and of course the church. I believe that CVI is bigger than just mere intervention to a single incident itself, but rather should be seen as an approach to public safety being held and executed by the people in the communities. It is a way to intervene in situations that has the potential to explode. Some of the ways that I see that the church can get involved is through chaplaincy. I mentioned earlier about the urban chaplaincy program that we built out in our church, and also that I introduced to Eden Theological Seminary. Through the chaplaincy, building out a crisis and a homicide response team that can show up at the scene of a shooting, providing training and strategies on how, there again, the clergy or the church should or could show up at the scenes when there is a shooting. For example, being what I call a watchman, a watchman being the eyes and the ears of what's actually happening in the community for both the victims and the families. The victims for both families, the victims for the families of the victims and the shooter rather. Sometimes there is a need while you're at the scene to pray for individuals. Some are open to prayer, some will request prayer. But the other things that you can do is just be present. There again, having that ministry of presence just so they're able to see. There are times when we will show up in clergy attire. There are times that we will show up in just plain clothing because everybody have a different response sometimes when they see clergy. However, we found that they are very warm when we're going out to the scenes. In most cases, you may not readily see clergy show up to the scenes. That's how we can continue to change that dynamic and to change the narrative on who's present when these horrific things are happening in our communities. I have found that families have a great deal of appreciation for that. Sometimes if a person happens to pass away, we offer assistance with funeral planning, grief counseling, relocation of housing for individuals, for frequent flyers, meaning someone who may be considered high risk. We do referrals for social services and stabilizations. Churches can do peace walks in area hotspots or areas that are identified by stats as places where crime or violence are more apt to happen in the communities. Sometimes we do this by engaging in conversations through law enforcement to try to figure out what's actually happening so that it's not just law enforcement being engaged, but that clergy have a voice in what's actually happening in the communities. The next thing is we conduct the peace walks at various times of the day. Typically, it may be a certain day that it happened. It may be a certain time. You'll find, churches that actually engage in peace walks sometime may go out in the wee hours of the morning. It may be midnight, it may be 2 in the morning, it may be 3 in the morning, 4 in the morning. It varies per community. Some communities you may want to start out doing it at 2 in the afternoon. That may not necessarily be when the crime is happening or the violence is taking place. However, it gives an opportunity for you to become a familiar face to those who are in the community. So they're not shocked when they see you, when you're going out. One of the things we like to say when we're providing training to churches and clergy and faith leaders and community organization leaders is don't show up like you're the mob. You don't want to have 12, 15, 16 people in a group kind of break up and be warm, be attentive when you're going out in these areas. Don't be on your phone, don't be talking, but, be aware of your surroundings. We've found that the community residents have appreciated us being feet on the ground in those communities. There again, with the peace walks, one of the things that happens is that, as you know, when you're driving versus when you're walking, there are things that you don't see when you're walking. When we get out, there are some signs that I didn't see. There are some houses that I didn't pay attention to when we were out in the community. And so it helps you to familiarize yourself with the community itself. It's just different than when you're in your cars. The other piece is creating a social justice ministry. Social justice ministries, I talk a lot about that when I'm working with seminarians, colleagues, clergy, faith leaders, community organizational leaders, but particularly in the churches, that we would have social justice ministries that focus on, advocacy, getting more direct funding around issues that contribute to the violence in our communities, lack of housing, food deserts, more funds to support the work that's actually happening on the ground. What happens if someone does, pass away, or if they're just seriously injured? How can the church be present? Our clergy began to advocate for ARP funds as part of the COVID relief funds that was released through the government, that our cities and local officials would allocate some of that money to violence reduction strategies, evidence-based strategies, so that the work can continue to be built out on the ground. Philanthropy. We formed a partnership with one of the local hospitals here in our area, so that we're able to get referrals from the hospital. There again, where it's not just the police showing up, but it's clergy showing up, it's faith leaders showing up, it's community leaders that are showing up that are notable and credible, in your community of what's happening there. With connecting with that partnership, it's called Hospital Linked Partnership or Violence Intervention Work. We connect with those who are victims of violence, families who may have lost loved ones, individuals who may be still alive, considered high risk. There again, how can we provide relocation services to them? Maybe they need to move out of town. That's another way. You may have a partnership with another church in a different state that have housing or resources to housing. Like now we have a family in the St. Louis area that really needs to move out of state. Well, they need resources, they need housing, they need to be able to go to reduce them being victimized all over again. And with the work, just there again, encouraging the clergy to continue to show up and understand the importance and the role of clergy and how we can continue to shape the narrative of what's happening in our community, showing up at the city council meetings of what's actually happening, engaging. We created a violence reduction roundtable that consists of the mayor, the chief of police, therapists and counselors. And this is all an extension to our social justice ministry that rolled over into the nonprofit work. And sometimes they overlap, but there again, we know that clergy is a soft space and can create brave spaces for the individuals who have been affected. So that's all I have. And I just want to say there again, just thank you for the invitation. And I will turn it back over to you, Reverend Dr. Sheila.
Thank you so much. Wow, there were so many powerful nuggets that you shared in that moment. Just highlighting a few before we go into Q&A. The social justice ministries, and I just wanted to lift that up because that's part of what we seek to do here through our Justice and Peace, our Just Peace ministries here, as many of us are Just Peace churches. But I love the examples you gave because that's one of the things we're looking to do, and that's why many of us are on tonight, to see how we might live into that a bit more. So thank you for lifting that up on all of the many examples of chaplaincy in the community. What a wonderful concept. The peace walks and how we might go about doing that, getting engaged in our local politics, just for the reason of making sure that we can reduce violence. And so we are grateful for those powerful words. And that just worked so nicely with Dr. Black's words of, I love this phrase, this cultural transformation that he mentioned. And it's like, if we could all do something in some way, we just might get there, right? All right, so I'm going to ask that you send your questions to Mike Nuroff. He's going to help facilitate for us. He just waved questions, and so that Dr. Rice Barnes can answer them. And so we invite you to share your questions. There are a lot of interesting things that she brought before us tonight. And Mike, are there any questions that are coming your way?
There's one here from Doris that I think both gets a little bit at what all three of our speakers so far have addressed, which is some of the deeper root issues of the numbness of how we feel about this issue, and then ends with great segue into what we're going to end with tonight, which is kind of what we can do in terms of pressuring Congress. So Sandy, I know, is going to speak to that directly, but you can see this question here in the chat, and if folks have kind of how do we get through the numbness, really, is I guess is the first question. Speaker responses to that to start with.
Well, Dr. Rice Barnes, would you like to share?
Okay, I'm muted. How do we get through the numbness? One of the things that I think about, as I mentioned earlier, gun violence being a public health crisis, and understanding that, you know, we're in the midst of two pandemics, right? We have COVID-19 that's happening, and then we have this pandemic of gun violence that's sweeping across our country, whether it's through single shooting or mass shootings. As a faith community, understanding that prayer is essential. And I think that as we continue to, number one, exercise our faith, but the tools of prayer and community, beginning conversations like this, just talking to one another, hosting group sessions and events where we can continue to be educated on the root causes of gun violence through systemic oppression, through white supremacy, through all these things that have happened to get us to this point. So the numbness of it, I think just walking and working through that and showing up, understanding that there's so much pain that's attached, but faith without works is dead. And the more we begin to move and be active, we become activated. At least that has been my experience, rather than become paralyzed by the feelings of being overwhelmed because of the lack of resources or because it happened again. We can't sit back and do nothing because that lets us know for sure that we will not begin to get results. But building out those social justice ministries inside of the church, I think is very important. And there again, showing up, sometimes when we're showing up for others that are experiencing these tragic events, something began to happen on the inside of us that helps us to be able to move forward.
Well said. Well said. Sandy's hand is up.
Yeah, I just wanted to piggyback onto what Dr. Rice Barnes was saying in terms of breaking through the numbness. And some of that can happen, I think, just in the different ways that we begin to address the realities of gun violence. And I'm reminded of a story. I work in the Washington office of the United Church of Christ. We're located right on Capitol Hill. And there was recently, I can't remember, there was a shooting of the Parkland students had happened, but there was another shooting that happened while the Biden administration was in office. And so they lowered the flag at half staff. And one of my colleagues was talking to her mother, and her mother was saying, well, we can't just lower the flag every time there's a gun violence death. And my colleague said, well, why not? You know, and that's kind of the idea of like breaking through this narrative of why not? Why can't we, you know, help people understand that this is the epidemic and the crisis that it is. So I just wanted to share that story.
Thank you. That's a very good story. And it reminds us that to break through this whole notion that we somehow can't continue to talk about something that's very important to talk about. Mike, is there another question?
Yeah, we had a couple more.
Okay.
Friend Susan Cushman, who's part of one of our Just Peace committees, she asked, particularly of you, Dr. Rice Barnes, if you've had any experience partnering with local police to address excessive gun violence, and if so, have the police been supportive or has there been resistance? I know that's a challenge a lot of our congregations have had, both in partnering with the police and then feeling pushback from the community when they do so, in many ways.
Yeah, absolutely. That's a great question. All of these are really, really great questions. You guys are on the ball. So as I mentioned earlier, we developed a violence reduction roundtable that have the mayor, therapists, counselors, faith leaders, community organizational leaders, probation and parole, and the police department was present. That's how we were able to get information and identify as well the area hotspots that we wanted to target and concentrate on. You do get some pushback from community members if they see you as allies with the police. In some cases, depending upon how individuals, whether you're clergy or not, credible messengers or what have you, are presented, it can be dangerous. It can actually be dangerous if you are considered to be a threat. That's why I used the term earlier when I was talking about clergy. It's like a soft face or a warm face because of that perfect love casting out fear. Having the love, when we go out in the communities, because we're going out in the spirit of peace and love, they know that. They know if you are trying to spy or trying to be some type of secret agent or what have you. That they have the community members have very high senses around that. And so I just say to people to really be authentic when you're going out and really have a genuine heart to help. With the police, there's a group that I am a part of that was recently formed. And at first I was a little like, I don't want to do that because there are police at the table that have been noted to have task force, to target the Black communities, particularly in our area. But I realized that if I wasn't at the table, then they're going to create their own narratives and continue to drive the work in the manner that they have been doing that's not beneficial for our community. So I needed to be there. And that's why I'm encouraging other faith leaders and clergy, be present. But my conversation, even with law enforcement, is we need to be able to show forth this narrative in our community. And when we are public, we're not friends with the police. We're not partners with the police. We're not allies with the police. There is a level of, some people like to say, cooperation with the police. I don't personally like to use that term. I like to say that we know that the police shows up at the scene when things happen. You call 911, the police is who show up. But that's why we can show up through chaplaincy, so that we are able to connect with those families and be, an alternative or an additional resource for them.
Thank you. Thank you so much. I just wanted to clarify. I didn't suspect that community members would resist. I was actually wondering if people, either local politicians or the police force themselves, if anybody in the police realm resisted that collaboration.
We haven't had anyone to resist because in some of the cases, what we found, particularly like in our city, East St. Louis, we have a shortage of police. The ISP, Illinois State Police, typically responds to shootings, the homicides and all of that. That's a separate conversation. Another reason why clergy need to be present, but we have not gotten any pushback because we understand this is our community. We are community stakeholders, right? And it is our job and our duty to be present. And so the police, we can't leave it to the police to police in a way that drives us out as clergy when we are called to be at the forefront. So even if they did try to resist, our clergy is such that we're not going to allow them to push us out. That's why we activated that ministry of presence and the social justice and the chaplaincy, response ministry.
Thank you. It's a very inspiring model. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
We had some great comments here in the chat about, reframing stories. focusing more on the victims and the shooter and seeing how we can advocate within media to do that, as well as the need to keep our flags at half mast all the time, given the number of gun deaths. We had one other question though about really if you could speak any more about the peace walks. I know a lot of our communities have peace walks different times, but maybe as for this network of folks interested in just peacemaking, could you say a little bit about what the character of those peace walks is there in St. Louis?
Yes, East St. Louis, we do, it's our work do extend, it does extend to the Missouri side, but we concentrate in East St. Louis, which is on the Illinois side. And with the peace walks, we do provide training to clergy, community members, faith leaders who want to go out and engage in the community in that as such. As I mentioned earlier, we do it at different times. Sometimes it may be 2 in the afternoon, sometimes it may be midnight. We've been out around 2 and 3 in the morning. Just depends on the situation. I think that there were times where we will go out and be by some of the area clubs because we knew that there were certain days of the week that shootings would likely happen or what have you. So they'll say, okay, there's a clerk. They know that you're there to help de-escalate, or to help avoid a situation exploding or what have you. So we do that through the violence intervention or de-escalation methods, and de-escalation can get very in-depth. There are many components of that, but the peace walks there, again, it helps you to be able to know the community, and it helps the community members to get a chance to know us as clergy.
Great. Sheila, that's it for the questions we've got so far.
Well, thank you so much. Wow. I've taken copious notes. There's so much information here that I think that will be helpful to our communities. I love the questions about how we go about collaborating with our law enforcement, local law enforcement, and how we go about doing the peace walks. I think those are very tangible things that can be done in our local communities. At this time, if there aren't any more questions, I would like to invite Sandy back to speak with us and to talk about a legislative review of sorts, as well as advocacy. There are some very important steps that Sandy talked about at the beginning, namely firearms are the leading cause of death for children in the US today. So I think this is very important topic. And so Sandy, please come back and share more.
Thank you so much, Sheila. Happy to share a little bit more about things that we can do. One of the reasons that I thought it was really important for us to not only focus on legislation, although of course as a legislative policy advocate, I have a heart for legislative advocacy, but there's also there's a great saying in the organizing community that if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. And so we're in a climate right now where we need multiple approaches. And that's why I think it was so important to hear from Dr. Rice Barnes and to hear about some of the community intervention programs that are happening and are other ways to address gun violence when on the federal level, at least, we're still facing a block in the Senate. So we have an expanded background check bill that passed the House last year, and it's stalled in the Senate graveyard, like so many other good pieces of legislation are stalled. And so we continue to want to advocate for that. I would never give up. I'm a never give up person. So I think we still have to push on the federal advocacy front. So we continue to need to push for that expanded background check law. We need to continue to push for bans on high capacity ammunition clips. They're right now, or in the next few days, possibly, the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization, which was stuck last year, will be reintroduced, and there are important provisions in the Violence Against Women Act reauthorization that would address firearms and the issue of intimate partner violence, and the fact that oftentimes women who are dating or people who are dating somebody aren't necessarily covered in the same way that a married couple might be. And so this is a great time to weigh in with your members of Congress on, or your senators certainly, on the reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, because we face a tough road on the firearms provisions. One of the things we often see happen is, you know, when it comes to compromise, they'll often drop those provisions that are controversial. And right now, we're at risk of losing those really critical firearms provisions. But then I would also say, look state and locally. And I saw in the chat, a lot of you raised the issue of ghost guns, which are guns that basically can be manufactured at home from parts that are purchased without any restriction and no background check. Extreme risk protection laws, which would address the issue of people who are in a extreme state of mental anguish, might have a gun, use a gun on themselves, or possibly use a gun on others, to be able to intervene in those instances. And then there are also the assault weapons ban continues to be an issue, and concealed carry is another issue that's happening on the states. Right now, some states have quite strict requirements for concealed carry and for gun licenseship. Other states are very lax. And one of the things that's happening is there's a move to allow people from a state with a lax gun license law to carry their gun to a state that maybe has more restrictive provisions and be allowed to do that. And so lots of this is happening on the state and local level. I think Mike is going to drop into the chat a toolkit that we've put together, the UCC has put together around ways that you can access some of the resolutions that the UCC has passed. And it also talks about not only doing legislative advocacy, but doing social media advocacy, getting the message out, reframing the narrative, doing media advocacy, other ways that you can, as Dr. Barnes was saying, shift the narrative are so critical. And I would also mention that our wonderful partners at the Council for Health and Human Service Ministries have a similar toolkit as well on gun violence prevention. And that came about from our joint partnership around the gun violence, viewing gun violence as a public health epidemic, and the 2017 General Synod. So that was a joint partnership. And they also have a really wonderful resource on their website on a toolkit on addressing gun violence. So I would also say, if you're not, I can't imagine anyone here is not a member of the Justice and Peace Action Network, but if you're not, please do join us. That's another great way. We send out alerts on things like the expanded background checks law and other laws, VAWA reauthorization and others. So it's a great way to stay connected. So I would say look on all levels. Don't stop fighting on the federal level. Continue to work on the state and local level on some of these other laws. And don't forget to use the media and to use your voice to try to to build a mass, critical mass of people who say enough is enough, and we can't live with this epidemic of gun violence at this rate without having some common sense measured gun violence prevention legislation actions taken.
Wow, thank you so much. I see Kyle. Thank you, Kyle, for that comment in the chat as well. She is a part of our CHSM team who is partnering with us tonight in this effort. Sandy, wow, that was very informative in terms of all of the many things that we're doing. The UCC is doing legislatively and taking action and advocating for on behalf of stopping the gun violence in our nation. It's truly an epidemic. Hopefully people will take a look at the link that's put in there. And I was remiss, we do have a local example, one of our very own, our co-chair of the Education and Advocacy Committee, who is prepared to talk a little bit about an example, a community example, and that's what Sandy was referring to as well. And what they have done in terms of gun violence in their local community. Bob, would you mind speaking? He's with the Coalition for Peace.
Sure. Our work is actually statewide, so I just want to clarify that. And I've actually found this to be very empowering because we get so frustrated at trying to get the national, especially legislative scene, to be responsive, and it's proven to be extremely difficult. So you can probably see in my ID there that the project that I lead that is under the umbrella of the Coalition for Peace Action is called Ceasefire New Jersey. And I've been involved with it since 1993, so 29 years. And the way we got involved, we were working against weapons trafficking abroad in the context of the first Gulf War, where weapons trafficking to Saddam Hussein had emboldened him to take over Kuwait. So we found that in New Jersey had passed a very strong assault weapons ban. In fact, it's still the strongest one in the country. The NRA was incensed and said, we're going to try to rescind that. And they put a lot of money into the state legislative elections, elected a veto-proof pro-NRA majority in both houses of the legislature. So this came to a head in the early spring of 1993. And the New Jersey Assembly, which is our House of Representatives, rescinded the ban. And they did it in the middle of the night. Seems like to me that happens a lot when evil things are happening. They're often in the night, in the dark of the night. 3 weeks later, the New Jersey State Senate was scheduled for a vote. And we organized, and a lot of it was in the faith community. We worked closely with faith leaders all over the state, mobilized and got people calling their state senator. We had the vote in March of 1993, and it was the closest thing to a legislative miracle I've ever seen. We had to get over a third of the senators to vote to keep the ban to prevent it from being rescinded. And instead, what we found was not a single New Jersey state senator voted to rescind the ban. And the pressure that was generated was just so magnificent. And the faith community was an important part of that. Our local state senator was interviewed. He was an NRA member. And they asked him, why did you vote to keep the assault weapons ban? And his answer was, because I got over 2,000 phone calls and 90% of them said keep the ban. Now, for a state senator to get 30 calls is a huge number, over 2,000. So this is what I think grassroots democracy can look like. And the faith community should be a key part of that. So this Ceasefire New Jersey project was on its own for some time, but then had some organizational struggles. So they came under our umbrella in 2010. And since they've come under our umbrella, we've succeeded at passing about 20 new gun safety laws over the last 21 years. Excuse me, 11 years. So that's really feels empowering. It's really exciting. Now, the way that we function as a group is to have monthly meetings. They were by conference call before COVID, and now they're by Zoom, which everything else is, like tonight's gathering. And we have several groups that are faith-based that are part of this, and they're working side by side with the Brady campaign, Moms Demand Action, March for Our Lives, which is what came out of the Parkland shooting. So we're all getting together once a month to communicate and to coordinate our efforts. And that is spearheaded under our Ceasefire New Jersey project. We have the Lutherans have a statewide advocacy ministry, the Unitarian Universalists do. There's Jewish women's groups that are involved. So this is really very exciting and empowering. And some of the issues that have been raised in the chat, for example, ghost guns, New Jersey has a ghost gun ban. That's one of the bills that was passed since our current governor came in his first term in 2018. So we've passed, continued to pass and strengthen our gun safety laws. And what that means is that if somebody, a ghost gun, just to kind of clarify a little bit of what Sandy was saying about them, is basically a gun that has no ID on it. I mean, a gun that's manufactured legally has to have a ID number on it, a tray, and so they don't have that. They're not fully, they're shipped in parts and then they're fully assembled, and often large numbers of them are assembled and then sold on the streets. So our Attorney General watches to see if ghost guns are showing up in New Jersey, and if they are, those people get prosecuted under New Jersey law. And so, unfortunately, it's also a problem in New York City, as you know. That's why President Biden was just there yesterday. A great sort of the weapon of choice of criminals who are intent on doing gun violence often is a ghost gun. And so this is a rising issue, and one of the sort of petri dishes that we can use to try to see how we can get a handle on this is, what are the states doing? What are the municipalities doing? New York City's working very hard on this right now under their new mayor. To me, this has been really empowering and exciting to be partnering and feeling that sense of energy, that sense of strength by being in close coordination with each other. It's been, it's led us to have a feeling of accomplishment and of making progress despite the gridlock that we're experiencing at the federal legislative level. Now, some things can be done also through presidential authority, although it probably will have to go through the courts, but largely through the ATF, Alcohol, Firearms, and Tobacco Agency of the United States government, guns can be regulated. So again, this is illegal to have guns assembled like this without any identifying number on it. So, I know President Biden is trying to figure out a way to do this, and I hope it'll pass muster legally. But I just want to encourage you to, not despair, to engage at your community level. Another thing that was passed, by the way, among those 20 gun safety laws, was funding for 12 violence prevention groups in the local communities in New Jersey. We have some of the worst, most poverty-stricken cities in the country, in Camden and Newark and Patterson. And often there's too much gun violence, Trenton as well. And there are projects now being funded where non-violence intervention people are on the ground and are ready to spring into action if they hear rumors that there's going to be some kind of gun use by a gang or whatever. And it's having a very good rate of success. Very good example is Camden, New Jersey. Not too long ago was known as the murder capital of the United States. And they started doing these kinds of programs. They reorganized their police department. They're now no longer have that designation. It's now much, much safer community. So these, community-based programs, like the one that Dr. Barnes mentioned just in her talk, these really work. They cost money, they take investment, they're labor intensive, but they do work. So
Thank you
that's,
so much.
I hope that's a hopeful sign for you.
Excellent, excellent, excellent follow-up. Wonderful work in New Jersey. I do want to address Sandy's hand that is up for some remarks.
And just a couple quick follow-ups to one of the things Bob was talking about. It's important to note that we currently do not have a head of the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, and that has been as a result of the Republican blocs on the nominee from President Biden, David Chipman. So that's a whole nother area of work that we have to do. And while I applaud the executive orders, our work has to continue on a legislative level because executive orders can be easily overturned should there be a new administration coming in. So I think, it's certainly important to have that action and at the same time, try to find some ways to make that legislatively happen as well. So just a couple things to mention there.
Wow, very powerful and well said. We do need to have a legislative action piece involved in all of the work that we're doing. So thank you, Sandy, for being here and for all of your good work as well. All right, so I think we've come to the point to start to close out, and there's just so much good information. So thank you, everyone, for this. Someone is sharing their screen. I don't know, but anyway, I just want to offer some closing thoughts, and first say that I think that Martin Luther King would be proud of our work tonight. Our presence is proof of the cultural transformation that Geoffrey talked about, Dr. Black talked about tonight, about how things were 50 years ago and how they are today, just by our showing up tonight. The examples that have been used from Dr. Rice Barnes to the example used from Reverend Bob Moore to the legislative work that Sandy has spoken of, all very powerful examples of how far we have come, but also indicate the work ahead. So I want to say that the UCC toolkits and the CHSM toolkits on gun violence are very helpful, and invite all of you here tonight to take a look at those. Also, if you are interested in becoming a Just Peace Church, we have Dale Bonds here and Reverend Campbell Lovett here. If they will raise their hands. They co-chair our membership and engagement committee, and they do a wonderful job. We are just delighted to have others of our steering committee with us as well. And, together, as was mentioned by everyone who spoke tonight, together, we can do this. We can make a better place for us here in the America that we live in the world that we live in. And I love the idea of local, state, and national partnerships. So with this in mind, I'll just read a little bit for the closing before we go into the announcements. In our Just Peace book, It says, "It is a calling of the church in every stage and place to bear witness by word and deed to the realm of God, which is the Holy One's divine will for creation. As parts of that body, we do this humbly and boldly, boldly because it is God's realm we bear witness to, not our own, humbly because we are but a part of the whole body, and thus see as in a mirror darkly. We do not have, in other words, a warrant to usher in God's realms forcibly. We do have a mandate to bear witness by our whole lives to the vision of God's realm, which the Spirit has enabled us to perceive." So I leave that message with you tonight. And thank you so much for taking your time out this evening to be here. Give yourselves a hand. Thank you so much. God bless you all. And Mike, can you give some announcements before we all part for the evening?
Thank you, Sheila, and thank you everyone for joining tonight. Just a couple of things that we posted in the chat. Peter Wells shared an article from UC News on a church community, United Church of Christ in Boulder, Colorado, that's been doing a gun buyback program. It's a very innovative just peace practice. And then I posted a bunch of different upcoming opportunities to engage with us and with the wider church. First is an upcoming webinar on February 23rd on politics of persecution in the Middle East with Mitri Raheb, who's one of our global partners. The Just Peace Network is co-sponsoring 2 upcoming webinars, one on armed drones on February 24th, and one on the impact of militarization on the environment, particularly in Hawaii on Red Hill, the Red Hill tanks that are polluting in Hawaii, and that's on March 9th. Those links and dates, those links are forthcoming. Next is Ecumenical Advocacy Days, which is in April. The link to the theme for this upcoming year is there. And finally, to join the UCC Just Peace Facebook. That's where a lot of this information will be posted and shared. And so there's a link to join that as well. So if you have any questions, feel free to be in touch with us. We will be sending out the recording to this webinar to all those who registered. And you can feel free to reply back if you have questions about becoming a Just Peace Church or any of the work of our office in Washington, D.C. Thank you all. Thank you, Sheila.
Thank you. God bless you all. Have a good night. Peace to
Peace be
everyone.
with you.
Peace,
And also-
everybody. Thank you. Peace.
Bye.